March 1943. Warsaw, Poland. The city breathed through shattered streets, its pulse ragged under the weight of occupation. The air smelled of smoke and fear, a haze that clung to every doorway and cobblestone. Soldiers marched in rhythmic certainty, their boots striking fear into civilians who had learned to move quietly, almost invisibly, like shadows. Above the city, in a cramped attic that creaked under the weight of its own age, a man hunched over a battered typewriter. Every key pressed sounded louder than it should, echoing against the slanted beams and peeling wallpaper. His fingers shook, not from cold, but from a calculation of risk. One mistake, one wrong letter, and the life he held in his hands could be extinguished. He paused, inhaled, and scanned the document before him. It was a birth certificate for a child who had never existed, yet who now, on paper, had a place in the world. A family would clutch it like a lifeline tomorrow, whispering prayers that no soldier would glance too closely, that no official would doubt its authenticity. In that small attic, paper became armor. Ink became defiance. And he, a man who had never fired a gun, found himself at the front lines of survival. Outside, the city roared with an oppressive rhythm. Streetcars clattered past, their metallic wheels cutting through the air like knives. German officers passed in groups, their laughter a brittle echo that never reached the ears of the desperate families hiding in cellars. Yet even as fear pressed against the walls, a strange paradox took shape. In a world governed by brutality, it was bureaucracy that could be weaponized. A stamp here, a signature there, a forged seal. These small acts of deception could outwit the most violent regime. The enemy relied on order, on paperwork, on the illusion of control. And that reliance became his weapon. He leaned closer to the paper, tracing the lines with a trembling finger, remembering the stories behind each document. There was Miriam, a mother of 3, whose husband had been taken in the first wave of roundups. She had slipped into his attic the night before, clutching her children close, whispering their fear into the shadows. He had given her new identities, new names, a shield crafted entirely from ink and graphite. He imagined her children running through the streets the next day under borrowed lives, their small hearts racing with a mixture of terror and hope. Each stroke of the typewriter carried their survival, and with it, a moral weight he could barely bear. The paradox of his existence was relentless. Here he was, armed with nothing more than paper and patience, facing an enemy armed with guns, tanks, and ideology. Teenagers ran errands for him, their legs carrying secrets and identities through alleys and checkpoints, slipping past uniformed eyes with impossible audacity. A boy of 14 had once delivered a stack of forged work permits, hiding them in the folds of his coat as officers leaned in for inspection. The soldiers laughed at his height, at the innocence on his face, never suspecting that in his small hands lay the fate of dozens. It was a quiet war waged not in the roar of cannons, but in whispers, in ink, in the careful placement of letters. He paused again, glancing toward a small window. Beyond it, the city sprawled like a wounded giant. Roofs were pockmarked with bullet holes, windows shattered, chimneys blackened with soot. Yet life persisted. A woman hung laundry on a line, her movements deliberate and cautious, as though the act of ordinary living could mask the extraordinary danger surrounding her. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, sharp and defiant, and for a moment, the man allowed himself to imagine a world beyond surveillance and terror. But the typewriter waited, insistent and unforgiving, and he returned to his work. Each document carried its own story, and each story weighed upon him. He forged passports for the elderly, whose hands shook as they took new names. Certificates for the sick, who needed permission to travel for care they would never see. Identity cards for children, whose very existence was now contingent on the fragile proof of ink. And with every forged line, he navigated a labyrinth of risk and morality. How many could he save before the walls of the attic were breached? How many lives could he rewrite before the Gestapo saw through the illusion? These questions had no answers, only the quiet resolve that kept him typing late into the night. At one point, a sudden knock jolted him. His heart raced, every muscle tense. He froze, listening. 2 raps again, deliberate. Outside, a courier waited. A young girl, no older than 17, clutching a package of newly forged documents. She had run across the city to reach him, dodging patrols, her small frame disappearing into shadows at the slightest sound. He opened the window, took the package with trembling hands, and whispered a warning. The streets are alive tonight. Every corner could be your end. She nodded, eyes wide, breathless, carrying more than paper. She carried hope. He returned to the typewriter, his mind replaying the hundreds of faces he had never met. Some had survived because of his work. Others had perished in spite of it. The attic smelled of ink, sweat, and fear, a combination that had become almost comforting over the months. In the dim light, he thought of the paradox again. It was the very machinery of order, designed to suppress and destroy, that allowed him to save lives. And it was precisely this contradiction that made him the most dangerous man in Warsaw. Quietly, invisibly, lethally. Hours passed. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the rooftops, brushing the city in a muted glow. The streets began to stir, life creeping forward despite the devastation. He looked at the stack of documents before him and realized the magnitude of what he had done. Hundreds, maybe thousands, could survive because of these simple sheets. And yet, he knew the danger was far from over. Every forged line, every stolen signature, was a challenge to an empire built on fear. The Gestapo could arrive at any moment. A single error could undo months of careful work. And yet, in that fragile attic, he found a strange serenity. He understood something fundamental about courage, that it is not always loud or violent. Sometimes, it is the quiet defiance of a man at a typewriter, the careful forging of life against death, the belief that ink can outlast bullets. The paradox of his existence was clear. The most powerful resistance was often invisible. The smallest acts could have the largest consequences. And as the city stirred awake below, he typed on, unaware of the lives he was silently rewriting, unaware that history might forget his name. But history, in its cruel way, often forgets the quiet heroes first. And he was racing against oblivion as much as he was against the occupying forces. Somewhere in the narrow streets and hidden courtyards of Warsaw, a child would wake tomorrow under a false name. A family would escape detection by a miracle of paper, and a small rebellion of ink would continue against an empire of steel. The man at the typewriter exhaled, fingers aching, eyes straining, and pressed onward. Each keystroke was a heartbeat, each forged document a lifeline, each risk a testament to human ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. And then, outside, the distant rumble of boots grew louder. He froze, a shadow falling across the attic floor. The city had awakened, and with it the threat. Somewhere in Warsaw, soldiers were moving closer. The paradox that had kept him alive, the use of paper against guns, was about to be tested. And for the first time in months, he wondered whether courage alone would be enough. Word count: 1001, July 1943. Warsaw, Poland. The city had grown quieter on the surface, a brittle calm masking the pulse of hidden resistance. Streets gleamed wet from an overnight rain, the puddles reflecting broken signs and shuttered windows. From the outside, everything appeared subdued, orderly, controlled. But beneath the surface, in dimly lit backrooms and attics, a network of ordinary people waged an invisible war. And at the center of it all was the man who worked with nothing but paper, ink, and an unshakable sense of purpose. The room smelled of damp wood and ink, the air heavy with anticipation. The forger sat at a battered desk, a stack of blank papers before him, each sheet carrying the potential to save a life. Around him, young couriers, clerks, and teachers moved quietly, carrying trays of documents, envelopes, and messages. They were the ghosts of Warsaw, unnoticed by the soldiers above, Yet their presence altered the balance of survival. Each person had a role, and each role carried danger. A single misstep could undo weeks of careful work. A young girl entered first, her footsteps tentative, clutching a folder of completed documents. She was barely 16, yet her face bore a determination far beyond her years. She handed the papers to the forger, whispering a warning about patrols near the southern bridge. The forger examined the documents, nodding with approval. Every passport, every certificate, every forged identity had to be perfect. There was no margin for error. The slightest inconsistency would betray the bearer, and betrayal meant death. He glanced around at his team. There was Merrick, a former schoolteacher, who had been quietly teaching children in basements since the occupation began. Now, he lent his knowledge of handwriting and calligraphy to make the forged signatures indistinguishable from the real ones. There was Hannah, a clerk who had once worked for the municipal registry, her memory perfect, her eyes sharp, catching the slightest flaw in a printed stamp or a misaligned letter. Together, they transformed blank sheets into shields against death, each one a small miracle. Outside, the city remained tense. Soldiers patrolled streets with the rhythm of inevitability. Checkpoints appeared like teeth along every major thoroughfare. Yet the couriers moved undeterred, slipping past their watchful eyes with impossible audacity. A boy of 14, his legs covered in mud from the Vistula River, darted across a square with forged work permits stuffed in his coat. Officers scrutinized him, leaning closer, their suspicion palpable. He held his breath, imagining the weight of every life dependent on those permits. And then, like a shadow dissolving into the night, he vanished, leaving only a ripple of hope behind. Inside the attic, the forger began a new set of documents. Certificates of vaccination, work permits, falsified ration cards, all mundane items that, under the Nazi regime, could mean the difference between survival and death. Each one required painstaking attention to detail. He copied fonts, mimicked stamps, even imitated the slight smudge of an official signature. It was a careful choreography, a quiet artistry born of necessity. As he worked, he thought about the paradox that had come to define his life. The system designed to control and destroy could, if understood intimately, be turned against itself. Hours passed. The room hummed with quiet activity. Hannah pointed out a discrepancy in a document, and Merrick corrected it with a flourish of his pen. The girl courier returned with a new batch of identities, and the forger examined each one with meticulous care. In a city where lives were measured in hours, every mistake could be fatal. And yet, despite the danger, there was an energy, a fragile joy in their work. They were not soldiers, but they fought just the same. The battle was invisible, yet its stakes were higher than most on the front lines could imagine. A sudden knock at the attic door made everyone freeze. The forger's heart raced. He signaled for silence, listening. 2 sharp knocks again, deliberate, echoing against the wooden walls. He peeked through a crack and saw a courier, a man he barely recognized, holding a small stack of forged documents. The man's eyes were wide with urgency, and he whispered that a patrol had turned down a nearby street unexpectedly. Every second mattered. The documents had to reach their destinations before soldiers arrived. And so, with practiced efficiency, the forger and his team packed the papers into bags, checking each one twice. Outside, the city seemed impossibly alive and dead at the same time. Children played in alleys, oblivious to the danger, while adults moved with careful precision, their eyes scanning for signs of the Gestapo. Couriers navigated this fractured landscape, their movements calculated and swift. One girl slipped a forged ration card into the coat of a terrified woman hiding her child. A boy handed a falsified identity to a man who had been fleeing the roundup for days. Each act carried a weight that no one outside the attic could understand. And yet each act was vital, a small thread in the fabric of resistance. As night fell, the forger paused to survey the work. Hundreds of documents had been created, hundreds of lives potentially altered by the careful stroke of a pen. He thought of the parents who would clutch these papers, whispering prayers in basements and attics, of children who would wake under false names, hearts racing with fear and hope alike. It was an alchemy of courage. Ordinary people, working in the shadows, using nothing but intellect, patience, and bravery to rewrite the fate of thousands. And yet, for all the triumphs, danger was ever present. A single slip could undo months of work. Soldiers could arrive without warning. A misread name or smudged ink could mean the end. He had seen it happen before, the consequences of error, and still they persisted. The paradox of the forger's work was that success depended on both invisibility and audacity. They had to be both ghosts and artists, unseen but essential, delicate yet defiant. Hours melted into the early morning. The room was quiet except for the hum of a lamp and the scratch of pens on paper. The team leaned back, exhausted but resolute. Outside, Warsaw held its breath, unaware that its survival often depended not on the roar of guns, but on the quiet genius of a man and his small, daring army of couriers and collaborators. They had learned to navigate fear, to turn bureaucracy into a weapon, to find hope where none seemed possible. And in doing so, they had become invisible architects of life itself. As dawn crept over the city, the forger paused one last time. He thought of the thousands of people whose fates rested in the fragile paper he produced, of the children who would wake under false names, of parents clinging to identities that were not their own. Somewhere in the streets, a courier ran, a bundle of forged documents pressed to his chest. Somewhere, a soldier passed, unaware that the enemy was not just outside, but in the ink on a page, in the careful mimicry of stamps and signatures. The paradox of survival was complete. In a world ruled by violence, ingenuity, subtlety, and courage could turn the tide. And yet, the shadow of danger lingered. The Gestapo were hunting. Their eyes were everywhere. Every step outside could be the last. And still, the forger returned to his desk, pen in hand, heart steadying itself against fear. There was work to do. Lives depended on it. Every forged document was a small rebellion. Every stamped certificate a defiance of an empire built on terror. And with every passing day, the invisible network grew stronger, more audacious, more vital. An army of civilians whose courage was quiet, brilliant, and deadly to tyranny. May 1945. Warsaw, Poland. The city was both triumphant and broken. Streets filled with the echo of liberation and the quiet, unspoken grief of those who had survived only to find their homes gone, their families scattered, their lives forever altered. Soldiers marched with banners fluttering, tanks rumbled through shattered avenues, and the flags of victory were hoisted over buildings pocked with bullet holes. The war was over, yet the aftermath was a strange, heavy silence. And in the middle of this chaos, the man who had saved thousands with nothing more than paper and ink remained in the shadows, unrecognized and unseen. He walked carefully through streets that had been battlegrounds just days before. Buildings leaned against each other like old friends holding one another upright. Shops were gutted, their windows shattered. Children ran barefoot, clutching tattered toys, laughing in the sun despite the memories etched in every corner. And he felt the weight of contradiction pressing against him. Warsaw had survived, yet so much had been lost. He had saved lives, yes, but the world around him was barely recognizable, and no one would speak his name. In the attics and basements that had been his workplaces, remnants of his work remained. Stacks of forged documents, faded and crumpled, lay hidden beneath floorboards or tucked into walls. Each sheet was a testament to lives rescued from the machinery of death, each signature a defiance of an empire that had believed it could eradicate an entire people. Survivors carried these papers with them, slipping them into pockets, hiding them in books, preserving them like sacred relics. Yet for all their importance, these artifacts of survival were invisible to the world at large. Museums would display uniforms, guns, and flags, but the quiet genius of a man who wielded ink as a weapon would be forgotten. He visited families he had helped. Some recognized him immediately, their eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. Miriam, the mother of three, now safely reunited with her children, embraced him with trembling hands. "You gave us life," she whispered. "You gave them names, and with those names, you gave them a future." And for a moment, he allowed himself the fragile satisfaction of acknowledgement. But even as he listened to their stories, he knew that the broader world would not understand. The war celebrated generals and soldiers, victories on battlefields, yet his victories had been quiet, imperceptible, carried out in hidden rooms and whispered transactions.